Welcome to Down to Art. I'm your host, Christy Gordon, and today I'm joined by the artist Peter Drake, the Provost of the New York Academy of Art, to talk to him about how he found his voice as an artist, as well as the importance of being informed as an artist, understanding art history and critical theory to know how our work fits into the context of what's being created around us. So, welcome, Peter. It's so good to have you.
Nice to see you, Christy. It's always a pleasure.
Yeah. And so you've been the provost of the New York Academy of Art for about 12 years now and teaching there even longer. And the mission of the Academy is blending technical skills with conceptual awareness and critical discourse. Can you talk a little bit about your background as an artist and as the provost of the New York Academy of Art?
Yeah, I mean, it's funny. I went to school at a time, this was the mid 70s, when, reductive abstraction was pretty much had a stranglehold on exhibitions, galleries, museums, whatnot, even magazines and just critical thought. And then when the 80s came around, everything got sort of shook up. And you could argue that it happened a little bit before that, that the new image people and the CalArts Mafia, as they're sort of jokingly referred to, kind of moved to New York and took over the nonprofits and really kind of came with a new energy about pictures and what they could do and how they reflected the culture. And the new image people were a different, slightly different generation of artists, but they were dealing with imagery, which was so at odds with what I had been taught at school. When I was in school, and I went to a very good school, Pratt, and I had some excellent teachers there. But at the same time, it was very difficult to be a figurative painter at that time because it just wasn't what people were doing, at least academically. Um, but I always found a way to sort of work with narrative and with picture making by taking at least one illustration course per semester. And that actually kind of saved me. And finding artists like Rudolph Baranik for me and Joe Smith and people that were working with the figure but maybe were a little bit under the radar actually helped a lot too. So by the time I got out of school, the art world had changed so much. And one of the first things I started to do, just from like a professional point of view, was I started going around to all the nonprofits and trying to get my slides into any slide registry that, at that time, that was how a lot of the nonprofits would work. They would, they'd accept your slides and then they'd look through their slide inventory and, see if you might fit into a group show coming up or a selection show or whatever. So that always, the nonprofits at the time were sort of the easiest route into the art world because as much as like the conceptual point of view of the art world was, as I said, very reductive, there were also very few galleries. People don't realize that the art world was much, much smaller at the time. And so there were very few that were dealing with, emerging artists for interest. It was always sort of blue chip, right? So the nonprofits had a very important function in that they allowed people to see emerging artists or artists that were working with unusual materials or people that were doing things that didn't make sense in the marketplace. And so, I showed at Drawing Center, Artist Space, Alternative Museum, a bunch of places that were very artist friendly. And that's such a huge thing to find, a support system when you're out of school to try to find some way to enter into an art world that seems prohibitive at the time.
Oh, that's so true. And actually, I'm not so familiar with like the art registries and the nonprofits. Is that still a system that like exists? Because I actually haven't done that. Like,
Yeah, they still exist. They function slightly differently.
oh,
Artist Space had a huge slide inventory that was open to the public. So curators could go to Artist Space and go through their inventory and sort of
oh,
see, they'd always be cross-referenced. So, if somebody was doing like, I don't know, color field painting, but it was influenced by, whatever, maybe pattern painting or something like that. You could find an artist that fit inside of those categories. And actually, Artist Space or rather, Drawing Center did the same thing. I
oh,
actually ended up being an artist curator there for about 4 years in the
oh.
80s. And we would, I'd meet with artists. I only had one day a week. I only worked one day a week, but I would meet artists all day long and have like 20 minutes to 30 minutes to talk to them about their work.
Oh.
And that, you know, going someplace where you're talking to another artist about your art, especially postgraduate, you feel like, everybody sort of hates critiques when they're in school. And then when you're out of school, you're like, hey, where is everybody? Like,
So true.
anybody have any questions? That kind
Oh, that's so true. Actually, I've been thinking about that a lot, like the importance of actually once we get out of art school, building for ourselves a little community of artists that we really trust, that we can show our work to regularly. I actually do it with a couple artists from the Academy, just every week or every 2 weeks. For 6 years now, we'll hop on a phone call, show each other what we've been working on, and
of, oh,
critically review each other's work. And we are so intimately like understanding about the intentions that we each have for our work, like that we can kind of problem solve with those intentions in mind with the other person. And it's been so supportive. What are some of your thoughts about just the importance of that kind of community?
oh, Christy, I can't say enough about how important that is. And, obviously, to some extent, it can be the people that you go to school with, it can be the people that you feel you've got an aesthetic connection to. Sometimes it's generational. But one of the things that happened to me is I became friendly with John Bowman and Mark Tansey and
Oh,
Bob Yarber and Hugo Bastidas. And these are all figurative artists at a time when we were all sort of breaking into the art world sort of around the same time. And it was great just to be able to compare notes and to, there'd be times when everybody's applying for a National Endowment Award and you find yourself being the only person who didn't get one. And, it feels horrible until you talk to your friends. They're like, oh, they don't know what they're talking about. And, that sort of camaraderie is really, really important. And, it's one of the things I really love about the Academy. If you look at like something like spring break, we just went this past weekend, there was like 40 or 50 alumni that were in spring break.
totally.
It was like a reunion.
Totally. I love it.
And I love seeing students curating their colleagues into shows and creating context for how to view the work. So it builds community, which is great, but it also, it starts to define the aesthetics that you want to apply yourself to. It sort of defines who you are creatively.
That is like so true. And it's true too about how it can open up opportunities as well without you even intending it to. It just naturally like does. Yeah, and get you
Yeah,
the like hard moments because we all have those as artists facing rejection or criticism, and then you've got this safe container of your close artist friends that can be like, "Oh, I've been there," like
I remember one opening I went to, and there was a post-opening party, and John and Mark and Bob were all there, and I was really miserable for some reason. I just felt like, I didn't understand my place in the world or something like that. And John Bowman came up next to me, put his arm around me, and he just said, "Where would you rather be?" He just knew I was miserable, and he's like, "This is the only place you should be." And I just felt great having an art buddy like that.
Oh, totally. And I love that story. And you mentioned too, like the context, like this group of artists, whether it's a small group or maybe a bigger group of artists that were sort of working in a similar style too, it starts to create a context for our work. And that also kind of has me think, I've been thinking about the importance of understanding our context that we fit into the like broader scheme of the art world around us. Not necessarily just with our friends, but also understanding the context that we're creating in and how it's contributing to the dialogue that's kind of going on around us artistically. Can you
Yeah.
speak a little bit about that and the importance of understanding how we fit in that way?
Yeah, it's interesting how things like that grow. I remember there was a period when I first started showing out in Los Angeles, and artists like Larry Geip were working out there, and we started to show in the same gallery, Carl Bornstein, and Carl was somebody who was very focused on contemporary progressive figurative art, and so suddenly you realize that this isn't just your little niche of friends, but this is like a bigger thing that's happening. And when I remember Larry coming to New York one time for a show at Bloom Hellman, and um, uh, a bunch of artists got together. Debbie Brown actually organized this, which was kind of funny because I didn't know who Debbie was at the time. And she organized a party for Larry at her loft. And all these people came from all these different sort of areas, but they were all interested in more or less the same thing. And you just realize that your small communities is actually being, there are these kind of ripple effects that go out, sometimes through curating, sometimes through writing, sometimes through just exhibiting. It just, you get to know more people, and your nucleus stays intact, but you realize that it's a bigger thing.
Ooh, yeah, that's true. Yeah, and I like what you said about how sometimes it happens in the art and sometimes writing too. And we're sort of doing lots of things as artists, like trying to think about how to talk about the work, write about the work, or create the work. That kind of ties into just like the importance of being informed as an artist and understanding critical theory and art history and contemporary art history. Can you speak a little bit about how you see that as an important part of being an artist?
It's really an interesting debate because I think that for me, I'm a visual person first. I consider myself serious about informing myself. But in some ways, and I was talking to a student about this recently, being informed isn't necessarily about defending your own work, but just being aware of the issues that are current and basically not making a fool of yourself if you enter into a conversation, which is a big part of it. It's like you have to be aware of things that are going on around you besides the work that are important to your own studio practice. So, being informed, it's difficult because it's always a moving target, right? There are always people, there'll be a period where everybody's interested in Rosalind Krauss and Hal Foster, and there'll be another period where everybody's talking about Kristeva and abject art making. And then, somebody like a Donald Cuspit can be around forever, sort of talking about figurative and representational art from a Freudian point of view. And it's like being aware of those things is important, but it may not actually shape your work directly. And I think there are times, and there were a bunch of artists, I think, in the 80s that were, kind of focused on postmodern criticism. And a lot of the time it felt like their art was just an illustration of an idea.
Hmm.
And that's something I've never found particularly interesting. I like it when people are informed, and information, whether it's coming from film or critical theory or just fiction,
Yep.
informs work. And just, being a participant, being a quasi-literate person, you allow all these things to enter into your work.
Yeah, yeah, totally. And I think you're so right about how it's a bit of a moving target. Like it's a little bit overwhelming when we realize that we need to stay informed about what's going on in the art world because there's no way we'll know everything. And at the academy, they have lots of good, structures in place for that, teaching classes on critical theory and then the lecture program. And what would you suggest to someone who's sort of at home trying to like learn these things and stay on top of it?
It might be, Hal Foster has a kind of compilation book of like critical theory over the past since 19th century or end of the 19th century, things like that, where you just get a taste of what is happening or has happened. It's a
Ooh,
good way to sort of create a foundation. But
ooh,
the harder thing, believe it or not, is staying on top of how quickly the art world moves. That it's not just which galleries are showing what artists or what neighborhoods they're in or anything like that. It's just being aware of emerging trends.
mm,
And that doesn't mean it's going to directly affect your work, but I think if you're, especially if you're in a city like New York or Chicago or LA where there's a deep pool of talent, you really do have to, you've got to hoof it. Like you have to get to openings, you have to see what's out there and see how things are changing, or um, just finding artists that you're excited by.
yeah, yeah, I always find it really interesting to see these trends. It's actually fascinating to me to realize I don't think that everyone's looking at each other either. It's like it just comes to people almost in a mystical way. It moves through artists, and I'm not sure exactly how to put it, but it's interesting for me to see the types of trends that come up sometimes. Yeah.
I also think it's funny to see when those trends make their way to academia, because what frequently happens in the
Oh.
academic world is that if people, have full-time positions or they're tenured or whatever, there isn't the same incentive to sort of stay on top of things. And it's almost like a baseball player that gets a huge contract. It's like, hey, great, I'm good for the next 10 years. But that's not true for everybody with a full-time
No,
position. But, the hard thing is just the art world, it moves more quickly. It moves probably in 5 to 7 year cycles. And
hmm,
academic world moves at more like a 10 to 15 year cycle. So you can actually be a little bit behind, even though you're going to a very, you know, currently informed academic environment. It just takes longer to seep in, I think.
that's that's totally interesting, but also somewhat comforting just to realize we don't have to be perfect at it. We just have to do our best and
Yeah.
sort of muddle our way through. Yeah, yeah.
I mean, that is one of the interesting things about teaching, though. Sometimes that's when you learn more from your students than you learn from, than they necessarily learn from you. Like I was speaking to an Iranian woman today about her studio practice, and she showed me an Iranian artist who I'd never heard of, and it looked to
Ooh,
me like as interesting as like a Hammershoid painting. It was like, how do I not know
ooh.
about this guy?
Yeah, that's so true. Yeah, teaching is almost like the final step in learning. Like yeah, it exposes us to new ideas and also anchors in our current ideas even deeper or something like that. Yeah.
Yeah, it's part of what's fun about it. It's a little bit intimidating. Somebody showing you like five artists in a row that you've never heard of, and you're like, oh, geez, sorry. I
I'm so
got to work
glad
a
that
little
you had
harder.
it. No, it's good to hear that you have these experiences too. I always feel like, oh no, when I've heard it, when someone mentions an artist that I've not
Yeah, I mean, you can stay up all night, just trying to prepare yourself and, look at every review that comes out and go to every website, and it's still not enough, because there's so
Yeah.
much.
Yeah, totally. And I really do think that that's comforting to realize that no, none of us are on completely on top of it. It's not actually possible, but we can do our best, and
Yeah.
that's pretty good. I remember when I was starting at the academy, just hearing about this idea of like the need to understand the language for me of painting, or or it could be drawing or sculpture, but understanding the language of the medium of our choice. And that seemed almost similar to this idea of being informed about critical theory and just contemporary discourse, because it seemed so overwhelming, such a big concept. Like, how will I ever understand the language of painting, and what does that even entail? Like, it's actually broader than you initially think. It's not just about the technique, it's almost maybe pulling in what types of references you might be making by using certain types of techniques, and it can get really complicated, but also really interesting. Do you want to speak a little bit about just this language of a medium?
Yeah, it's sort of in some ways my favorite thing to talk about because I feel like, people will talk about the word technique, and I hate that word actually because I
Hmm.
think it's really it's oversimplifying because language, if you're talking about the language of Dutch 17th century painting, if you're talking about, working with indirect paint, if you're talking about, medieval, egg tempera, if you're talking about, you know, 60s and 70s stain painting traditions. These are all languages, right? They're alive. They're alive. They come with associations. They come with more than just, an object technical awareness. It comes with, to some degree, baggage sometimes, but it also comes with real richness. And understanding that and understanding how these languages can work in concert with each other or that they can be oppositional is actually really important because I think that's when language becomes metaphorical. That's when you get all of this additional oomph into a painting because you're talking about the way that the actual application of paint can bring meaning to a painting.
That is like completely fascinating. And yeah, and I thought, oh, you put it so well. Yeah, it's fascinating. Can you think of any examples in your own practice? I don't know, I'm kind of putting you on the spot, but of where, maybe just to give examples for people, if it's not too on the fly, of where there might have been a moment where you used a certain technique that was drawing certain associations and therefore enhancing the meaning of the work, if anything comes to mind.
Yeah, no, there was a period, an exact moment actually, and this is partly how my iconography evolved, but it's also how my language evolved. And I was literally living on the Lower East Side on Delancey, in this just the tiniest apartment you could possibly imagine. I'd literally sleeping on the floor, and I'd have to roll up my bedding to pull out my drawing board. And I had been working on these pen and ink drawings, and I was using black India ink and white India ink. And I was using the white India ink to some degree to make corrections, but it was also just to turn form and things like that. And I ran out of white ink, and I had this disaster of a drawing in front of me, and I just started sanding into the paper as a way of getting rid of the ink. And as soon as I did it, I was like, oh, that's reminding me of something. And it reminded me of a couple of things. One, I've been looking at a lot of fresco painting. I was looking at Piero, I was looking at Giotto, Masaccio, all this sort of like the who's of Florentine painting. But I was also looking at frescoes that were decaying. And there was something about the decay that I found really interesting. Like it felt metaphorical. It felt like it was talking about the passage of time. It felt like it was talking about destructive influences. All these things started to happen. And I wanted that to be in my work somehow. I wanted to be able to talk about contemporary culture, but from a point of view of the metaphor of decay. So as soon as I started sanding into the pieces, a couple of things happened. One, I felt like I was rendering with light instead of shadow, but also I was creating a surface that was metaphorically loaded with all these associations and associations to, Quattrocento fresco painting, but also associations with just destruction in general. And I felt like if you're going to be talking about, in my case, the drawings that I was doing at the time were these 4-foot by 8-foot drawings of suburban settings.
Yep.
And I wanted them to look like decayed frescoes. I wanted them to have, in some ways, the monumentality of fresco, but I also wanted that decay to be there to talk about the loss of some kind of innocence or the loss of some kind of ideal. And everything started to come together at the same time. The language was suddenly perfectly in sync with the iconography that I was trying to develop. So it was just one of those aha moments where you just realize, okay, I've got a lot of work ahead of me. Like there's so much that I can get to through this language and through this imagery. And it was really important to me. And, that approach to drawing and painting has been on and off consistent. Right, like right now, I only work subtractively on drawings, but I tend to work additively in when I'm painting. But the idea of looking for decay in the imagery, that's been pretty much a consistent aspect or variable in my work.
That's so interesting and such a perfect example. Yeah, it is like amazing when the technique starts to enhance like the meaning and you feel it happening. Like you kind of know, you're like, finally, I definitely understand the language because I can see this association that I'm making with this mark making. Yeah. And it's really interesting to hear more about how you found your artistic voice. I've been looking at your work for many years now, and I've seen it really crystallize. Like it was always pretty crystallized the whole time that I've known you, but I feel like it's actually become even more clearly like what you're like meaning to do. And so I was wondering what it was like for you finding your artistic voice. I think a lot of what you just said kind of touches upon it, but can you think of anything else that you did or that was a part of that?
The hardest thing, really, in some ways, is to sort of find your voice and then to realize that your voice is going to be evolving throughout your life, that it really shouldn't stay static. I think
Yeah.
that's the one that surprises people the most in their life is that, suddenly something shows up in your studio and you don't know what to make of it. And it can be a little frightening to sort of let go of what you may think of yourself or what other people may think of you, and then to sort of strike off in a new direction.
That's
It
so
takes a
true.
little nerve.
Yeah, that is so true. I really like admire artists when I see them go with that like impulse.
Like there should be new images that you're interested in. There should be new ways of doing research that you're interested in, and all these things, even new technology that you can bring to your work. Like there were a number of years ago, I did about 10 animations in Adobe After Effects, and I was using toy soldiers and things like that. But when I first started animating, it was like, oh my God, they're alive. It has this like weird, magical sort of Frankenstein like moment of like, oh my God, that horse looks like it's galloping. Um, and it was great. But I also realized that there were times when I would scroll through the animations when I would find a frame that I would never have conceived of by myself, but because you're doing things like moving the camera or changing the lighting, there are things that happen in between frames, almost in between your your narrative beginning and end, that lent themselves to new paintings for me. And compositions that I never would have come up with otherwise if I weren't looking through the lens of this software.
I remember those animations, but
Yeah.
that's really interesting about the in-betweens. It seems like just staying open to the epiphanies, sort of trying things out and then staying open to when something sort of that you didn't expect has suddenly really caught your interest and then going with it. Yeah.
Yeah, I was talking to a couple of students today about that a lot of art making, I think, is just remaining open,
Mm,
like just almost training your eye to see things. And I was talking to this one student about the minimalists, that in some ways, I actually love the minimalist period. There's just thinking something about it that just really appeals to me. It's
mm,
partly because I went to school during that period, but they also, in some ways, trained your eye as a viewer to sort of look at the world that they were seeing. You
mm.
would see, bricks in a different way. You would see cement blocks in a different way. It had this effect of sort of reorienting your consciousness. And I think most great art does something like that. It tells you how to see the world or gives you another way to see the world.
Actually, I remember at the Academy, John Jacobsmeyer saying something like, "Show me how you see the world," or something like that. And I thought it was like really interesting. That seems to touch on what you're saying, that it's kind of
Yeah,
altering the way we look at the world. Ooh,
yeah.
that's interesting. What about like this whole idea of style? Like I know a lot of artists want to like have a style but how have you seen style actually develop for an artist?
Oh, it's so funny you should ask that. I was talking to a colleague about that just today.
Huh.
That Mark Tansey, people don't realize that he was Helen Frankenthaler's studio assistant when he was very young. Their work had nothing to do with each other, so it's kind of the weirdest coupling of assistant to whatever master. And I love Frankenthaler's work. I think she's one of the most amazing, um, post Abbott X painters in the world. But she turned to Mark at one point. He was just talking to her about like the business of being an artist. And she said, "Well, Mark, you find a signature style and you do that for the rest of your life," which is funny because it's not what she did, but it's what a lot of people thought. That's how you survive in the art world. You sort of found your one signature thing and you just did that ad nauseum. But I mean, I think that's the deadliest approach to a studio practice. It's so self-limiting, and it's really more about business when it comes right down to it. When somebody does that, and it feels like when you do that, obviously there's some people, and I believe like somebody like Agnes Martin shouldn't have done anything but what Agnes Martin did, and which is very reductive, but purely who she is.
Hmm.
I wouldn't want to see Agnes Martin make a gestural painting. I'd be probably sickened if I saw something like that. But I think most people make that decision as a way of sort of securing their
Yeah,
livelihood. But if
yeah.
that's all you're doing, like sell real estate, you'll make a lot
I
more money.
know. Yeah, that's what I feel like too. It's like, why would I become an artist then?
Right,
Yeah, there's
exactly.
better options for money. Yeah.
So
Yeah.
much better. God.
Yeah. And so what do you think is a more effective approach to like developing a style in an authentic way that maybe emerges and probably evolves, like you're saying too?
Yeah, I think it evolves, but I think there are times when, if you start to do like an inventory of the things that affect you, like the novels that affect you, the movies that affect you, like when you walk into the Met, what's the first room that you go to and why do you go to that room? What is it about certain pieces that just keep coming back to you, or certain periods even where why are you more interested in Dutch 17th century painting than French 18th century painting? What is it about these periods that draws you to them? I think it's worth it to do those kinds of inventories on a kind of regular basis, or just check yourself why is it you're drawn to certain things. And I think that some part of your style or the evolution of your style will be a reflection of that. And
Yeah.
being
Yeah.
honest about love.
Yeah. Yeah, that's true. And it is worth it to do this kind of like make this conscious effort to kind of figure out what it is that we like, not just hoping it'll come to us. It's this
Yeah.
to go. And then as far as like brainstorming ideas, I was wondering, do you do like quick sketches, like little thumbnails before you create a larger like piece, or do you just start right in on the larger piece, or what's your kind of brainstorming process?
I've I've approached it so many different ways. There was one period in my life, and I'm a really bad sleeper, so I'll wake up 10 times a night. And there was one period when I was working almost exclusively from dream imagery, and I would just make little notes to myself and just really simple sketches. And then the first hour in the studio, I would spend just trying to flesh out those sketches. And then I'd usually turn them into like a watercolor and gouache sketch, which would get up, blown up to maybe a subtractive drawing. And then maybe I would do a bunch of different sketches of different aspects of the piece. And I mean, each piece would take about a month for me to just, from sketch to final resolution. And that was a really interesting period. It was very thoughtful. It was very sort of immersed in the process. But then I've changed. There was a period where I worked almost entirely from Photoshop files, but I would do all of my collaging in Photoshop and all of my sketching in Photoshop. And then I got to a point where I found that a little bit frustrating because I felt like I was just reproducing creative document that I had always already created.
Yeah.
So I sort of went back to basics. And I remember seeing pictures of Eric Fischl's studio way back in the day where he'd have a painting up, but he'd have like a photo source from one magazine here, a photo source from a nudist magazine over there. And just like the collaging was actually happening, you know, during the process of painting and the editing. It never happened in the sketch. It never really happened in Photoshop. It happened in like this kind of woolly world where the seams would actually show. And there's something about seeing those seams that I find a little bit interesting. Just not, they're not like glaring or anything like that, but it's not about the perfection of a Photoshop document, you know?
Yeah. Yeah, that's really interesting. What kinds of tools do you use to kind of bridge this gap between like flow, where you're just creating almost intuitively a little sketch or thumbnail, and then taking that, blowing it up first to the watercolor maybe, or to the larger piece? What kind of, I think every artist has to figure out how they do it for themselves. Like for me, I use photo reference and I sometimes make little plasticine models, and I know some artists use 3D modeling. What kinds of ways do you have to support yourself in making that leap so that you can make a finished painting out of your idea?
Well, I've got
Or
a bunch of different ways that I approach my image making lately. I mean, there have been times, I will go back to these methods frequently. Like I have gone through family home movies, right, frame by frame, and I'll find a frame, like let's say you're looking at a birthday party or something like that. If you look at the movie, it's all continuous and it's consistent with the primary narrative, which is you're having a happy birthday. But if you look at it frame by frame, there's always going to be a frame where somebody is doing something a little bit weird, or they'll express their face that says a little bit more than what the primary text is saying. And I find that an interesting tool to play around with, to sort of look for, the subtext. And I've done that with television shows where like I was taking these television shows from the 50s and 60s. Like you've never heard of this one, but it's called Ozzie and Harriet, and it was basically following a family, but it was a real family. It was like the kids were their kids. It was a married
Oh, wow.
couple. So
Whoa.
in some ways, it was like the first reality show, right? But it was all
Yeah.
scripted. So, and I always found it really fascinating because it was a husband and wife that were, a production company that made this television show that was incredibly successful. One of their kids ended up being like a music, like a rock star, sort of pop rock star, and but it was all about this sort of very, in some ways, um, cleansed understanding of American culture. And
Hmm.
even though they would deal with some difficult topics, believe it or not, especially like the role of men and women in the marriage, and like issues of control, things like that, it was still pretty much a glorified view of American family life. And so what I started doing is scrolling through those television shows and finding those same moments where there seems to be a text that's at odds with the primary text. And again, as a tool, it's just kind of a fascinating way to look for pictures. You start to train your eye to look for that unexpected moment.
Ooh, that is interesting. I like this looking at the in-betweens in a lot of your work, like with the movies and then the animations that you were making. Actually, one final like question just popped into my mind. I'm working with someone right now who's been she's using a lot of like references to movies and she's always kind of wondering how that fits in with copyright issues. And I know a lot of artists that like work with movie stills. How do people like navigate that? I don't know. Or what thoughts? I mean, it's a gray area in all sorts of ways.
It definitely is. I mean, if you were to talk to Jeff Koons, I'm sure he'd have a very
Yeah.
different perspective than I do. Um, Most of the time, if you're choosing frames that are in between the primary text, nobody even recognizes the primary text. They're not even sure what
Sure.
you're talking about.
True.
So it's actually kind of funny because it's a way of sort of flying under the radar. But
Huh.
also, these shows are so old at this point, they're probably,
Oh, true.
God, they're like 60 or 70 years old. I don't think anybody's looking. You know,
Yeah.
Austin and
That's
Harriet, they've been
fine.
dead forever. So
Yeah, totally. Maybe would they be in the public domain? I don't know if that happens for movies.
I,
It might
I
be,
think
right?
I think they probably would be, but I don't. I mean, that's one of those things. I ran a professional practice course at Parsons for many years, and I'd always bring in a volunteer lawyer for the arts
Oh,
because
cool.
those are the questions that people always ask. Like, you do not mess with Disney, for instance. Like anything Disney,
Oh.
if you try to use that in your art, they will sue you like crazy.
Oh, yeah, that's interesting. Certain companies may be more on it than others. That's actually a really good point. I never
Yeah.
even thought of that. And then I see a lot of artists, though, referencing pop culture, like, Star Trek or other movies and things like that. And of course, when we're not that well known, I doubt anyone will sue us. But I
Yeah.
wonder for someone who's like really concerned about, yeah, I don't know. What do you think about Star Trek? Do you know anything about that?
I don't, but I
No, that's
would think
okay.
that you're right. It's really your prominence. Like if
Yeah.
somebody, if you copy something from Disney and if it's for sale in the secondary market at, Sotheby's or something like that, and it's selling for $2 million, yeah,
Yeah.
you're going to hear from
That's
their lawyer. Believe me.
yeah, yeah, totally. No, I mean this is always a developing area too, the whole copyright thing. It's always like changing, but I'm glad we got to touch upon it.
Yeah.
Yeah, this has been such an amazing conversation. Thank you so much
Oh.
for taking the time, Peter. Where can people learn more about your art and the New York Academy of Art?
Well, you can always go to my Instagram account. That's always a good way. That I tend to keep that probably more current than anything else. But I show with Craighead Green Gallery in Dallas, with Linda Warren Projects in Chicago, and Michael Healy Contemporaneo in Mexico. And shows come up now and again, and just the usual kind of thing.
Nice. I'll definitely include a link to your Instagram in the description.
Yeah, but again, part of what's interesting about that is the ways that social media is changing the delivery systems of art and the reach that artists can have.
That is
It's,
actually so true. How do you see it having changed things?
I mean, just to give you an example of this, a woman got in touch with me about a year and a half ago through Instagram. I didn't believe it was real. I thought it was one like those Nigerian things where I
Yeah.
have $50 million when I want to buy your art. But she ended up buying two really substantial pieces for her family. And I was
Wow.
joking with my wife Janice about this, and I said, "Do you think it's too soon to ask her for a recommendation of a gallery in Dallas? Because I've never shown there before, and I've always wanted to." And Janice is like, "Oh my God, it's way too soon. We just met this woman." Literally, next day, she Instagrams me, she DMs me, and she says, "Hey, I know this gallery in Dallas that I think would be really interested in your work." And literally within a month, I started showing with the gallery.
Whoa,
Like
yeah.
that would not happen any other way except through
No.
social media.
Yeah, totally. That's like everything that an artist wants, like painting sales, gallery shows, like it just
I
all comes
know.
to you. That's like amazing.
And it's without anybody else reaching out except through, this delivery system that, the images are tiny. Like, how does anybody make a decision about something like that? And she was so,
Yeah,
it was just, it was kind of amazing. But you
yeah,
hear more and more artists that's happening for them where, you know,
totally.
they just, most of their sales are not happening through galleries. They're happening through social media.
Yeah, yeah, totally. And what do you think about how artists need to navigate this whole system though? Because I find that I need to be careful about when I post my work, like not show it when it's in a vulnerable stage, only show it once it's finished. Otherwise,
Yeah.
it mess with my process. I don't know. I don't think everyone's like that, but do you have any theories around navigating?
Way I get around that is I do, an animation. I frequently will take a picture of a piece I'm working on at the end of the day for the course of a month, and then I'll stitch it together into an animation. And it sort of shows the process because I feel like that's
Uh,
an interesting thing to share with people is just how you think and how you edit all of that. Um, and by the time they actually see it, the piece is done. So there's no commentary midway through it, so you don't get messed up that way.
ooh, that's
But
a
I love seeing people's process. I mean, I love watching other people's videos.
Me too. Yeah. Yeah, me too. And I find that the way you and I are both doing it, where we might show the process once the painting is totally finished, it keeps it so it actually feels safe. It doesn't feel too vulnerable. Like I can create and try out whatever I want in my practice and then post it,
Yeah,
safe to go on Instagram without, you know, too much risk that it'll get. Because people may say that they like it or they may say that they hate it, but it won't affect the piece at that
yeah,
point.
it's already
Yeah.
done. I'm done
Yeah,
with
it's
that.
done. Yeah,
I'm on to the
exactly.
next thing.
Yeah, totally. I'll definitely include a link to your Instagram in the description. And then for the New York Academy of Art, I'll include a link to that too. I'm sure people will be curious to learn more about.
Yeah, we just had a really wonderful event. We do this every year. It's a Will Cotton drawing party where we have three setups and probably 40 or 50 artists drawing from, live models. And it's always a lot of fun. And Will's super charming. And most people end up giving their drawings to the school for auction. It ends up being a nice kind of fundraising, you know, it's a
Huh?
boozathon.
That sounds really fun. I'll have to make it next year. I haven't actually
Yeah.
seen. It sounds amazing. Yeah.
Oh, you'd love it. Yeah, you'd be
Yeah.
perfect for it.
I would love that. Yeah, well, oh, thank you so much for joining us. You just had so many great, like, such great wisdom to share with everyone. So thank you so much, Peter.
Yeah,
And
my pleasure. Always a pleasure to see you.
thank you. And I'll talk to you soon. Bye,
Okay.
Peter. I hope you've enjoyed this episode of Down to Art. Thank you so much for being with us.